Rejoice, rejoice. Emmanuel shall come to you, O Israel. We sang that as the refrain to O Come, Emmanuel, the opening song today. Probably the most widely known Advent song in the world. O come, Emmanuel. And the first verse, O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appear. We have sung that since we were little kids. I don't know if you know the backstory of that song. About 500 to 600 years before the time of Jesus, there was one of the worst events that had taken place in the whole Israelite history up to that time. It was called the Babylonian captivity or the Babylonian exile. And the Babylonians were a very strong power at the time, and they captured Jerusalem, and they even destroyed the temple that Solomon had built, which was the center of their faith. And the Babylonians had one other thing they did as a way of maintaining their power. They would take all the key people, anybody of influence, anybody of prestige, out of a country, and they would exile them into other countries. That way, the people that they had conquered could not rise up against them. The Great Exile, the Babylonian captivity. And it went on for about 70 years. If you can imagine being exiled out of your own land for that many years, that's a couple of generations. Their hearts must have been broken. They even wondered, how can we continue to practice our faith? How do we maintain our sense of a nationality? We are so bad off. They longed to go home again. That's what happens when you're in exile. Well, that went on for about 70 years, as I said. And then Babylon was conquered by Persia. And Cyrus the Great, the leader of the Persians, he said, you may go home again. And so they returned home. And that is the setting for the first reading that you heard today. This section of Isaiah, late in the prophet Isaiah, takes place as the people return home. And so Isaiah writes, he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to bring glad tidings to the poor, to heal the brokenhearted, to set captives free. And the people must have delighted in that. And so that sense of delight, that sense of joy, is what we really celebrate today. We call it Gaudete Sunday, Latin for rejoice. Rejoice. And what are we rejoicing? Not simply because we have a third candle lit in the Advent wreath. That's a symbol. And not just because we're getting that much closer to Christmas. We rejoice because the captivity is over. We're being called out of exile to come back home. Now, I have found out there are some parishioners who felt that they've been exiled. We have people from other countries who felt like they had to leave, and they now reside here. They feel like they're living in exile. Most of us, however, have not had that experience personally, at least not in the physical sense. But emotionally and socially and spiritually, we may feel like we are in exile. What does that mean to be in exile? It means that somehow we feel distant. And I'm not just talking about the pandemic, but that certainly is the backdrop for a lot of things going on. We feel like we're distant from people we love. And maybe that was going on before COVID, and now we're just becoming more aware of it. Or maybe we're in exile from ourselves. There's no peace of mind in our hearts. Or we even feel distant from God, and we wonder, does God care about us, or have we been forgotten? How do we keep going on? And probably the heaviest thing for almost all of us is sheer fatigue. We're exhausted. There's a heaviness over so many of us so frequently. I have to tell you, that's one of the reasons why I love to see the kids, because they don't seem to have had that taken to heart as we adults have. And they are the reminder to us. But if we are in exile, then we go back to those words in Isaiah, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to bring glad tidings to the poor. Be happy because Your exile is at an end. And Jesus himself quoted this passage from Isaiah. You probably know it from chapter 4 of Luke's gospel. Jesus goes into his synagogue in Nazareth, where he had grown up. They handed him the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and he unrolled it. And this was the passage he read. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, has anointed me to bring glad tidings to the poor. He read this aloud, and then he sat down, and everybody looked at him, and he said, I want you to know this is now fulfilled in my presence. He is the anointed one. He is the one who calls us out of exile. And in the gospel reading, I love this passage when John the Baptist is there, and the Pharisees say, okay, if you're not the Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one, if you're not Elijah, and if you're not the prophet, then why are you baptizing? And his answer is so cool. He says, there is one among you that you don't even recognize. He doesn't say the future tense, there will be someone among you. There already is someone among us. In other words, we are already being called out of exile. So our rejoicing is not based on nothing. It's based on the reality the Lord is already present. We have to hear his voice. Come out of exile. We are not abandoned. We can be home. In Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, the second reading, and the Thessalonians were just an early fledgling Christian community, so he gives them a lot of warnings. He tells them, rejoice, don't lose your faith, discern carefully. But then he says something that is almost like a tagline for my own life. He says, don't quench the spirit. When I read that, I think of like people sitting around a campfire at night, and the fire's been burning, but they have a bucket of water there because they know they're going to quit. So they quench the fire. They literally pour the bucket of water on. And Jesus says, don't quench the spirit. Don't put it out. Let it burn within you. I think sometimes what we do is in our own dismay and discouragement, or maybe even neglect, I don't know if we quite put out all the embers of the Spirit, but they're not burning really bright. So we need the faith to be enlivened. The Spirit of the Lord is upon Jesus. The Spirit of the Lord is also upon us, enlivening us. That Spirit cannot be quenched. And we've got to respond to that Spirit in the way that we can also reach out to each other. We, as a community of faith, are being called out of exile. We are homeward bound.